Welcome to Food for Thought in its 18th year. Thank you for listening. If you've been listening for years, thank you for listening if you're new. Today's episode is From Sushi to Soba, a vegan-friendly journey through Japanese cuisine. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com. You can also connect with me, drumroll please, not on Patreon, but on Substack. If you would like to subscribe to my Substack, it's called Compassion in Action. It's practical inspiration for living zero waste, plant-based, and cruelty-free. You can be a free subscriber. You can be a paid subscriber. And all of my amazing Patreon folks, I'm going to be slowly moving them over to Substack, not because Substack is a podcasting platform, because it is a writing platform. And everything I do is about writing, whether it's content for audio, content for video, content for reading. And I'm just so grateful to all of my supporters over these years. And Substack is really ticking the boxes for me in terms of being able to provide really in-depth content and also really meaningful connections. So I'll talk more about this in an announcement about Substack because I really want you all to be over there. And it does, by the way, enable audio content, so I can even move my podcast feed over to Substack. The potential is just really great. I'm moving farther and farther away from Instagram and Facebook and the platforms that just really favor and reward bad behavior. I don't know how else to say it. It's just not serving me. And I'm not interested in performance. I have a lot to say and share, and I am looking forward to continuing to do so over on Substack. You can always find me at joyfulvegan.com, and you can find the mailing list over there as well. So maybe start there if you don't know how to find me on Substack and if it's new to you. I also have a post on Substack that explains why I'm on Substack. So once you're over there as a subscriber, you can read that post. You can also pre-order your copy of my new book, A Year of Compassion, 52 Weeks of Living Zero Waste, Plant-Based, and Cruelty-Free. And I really hope you do so. And by the way, if you are not in the San Francisco Bay Area to attend our in-person book launch celebration, I am now hosting the day before that a virtual book launch celebration. So on Saturday, March 22nd, you can join me. I am encouraging you to RSVP, and you can join me from wherever you live. And if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area and you want to join me at Mrs. Dalloway's, I would love to see you there as well. Everything's over at joyfulvegan.com, under events, under pre-order, all the things. So I hope you join me in celebrating this new book, my 8th book. I'm really proud of it, and I think it's going to have an impact on all the things we care about, whether it's our own health, whether it's the animals, whether it's the environment, all of it. So you can find that wherever books are sold, or you can buy a signed copy from me at joyfulvegan.com. Okay, we are leaving for Japan in about a month from now. This will be our 2nd time traveling to Japan. Technically, it's our 3rd trip because we ran 2 back-to-back trips, 2 different groups of people in 2024. This time we have one group in 2025. And before, on our first trip, we went from Tokyo to Kyoto. And on our second trip with the groups last year in 2024, we went from Kyoto to Tokyo. And so when we were deciding about 2025, we just felt it made more sense to experience Japan going from the old to the new. And that is definitely going from Kyoto to Tokyo. This is not an episode on the history of Japan. If you actually want more history, especially from a food perspective on Japan, I really encourage you to go listen to part 1. I called it Vegan in Japan Part 1. I'm not calling this episode Vegan in Japan Part 2 because I want you to listen to this episode even if you're not traveling to Japan, even if you're not planning a trip to Japan. That's okay. I want this episode to be interesting to you because we're going to talk about specific foods and dishes that are either vegan or veganizable, whether you're going to Japan or just going to a Japanese restaurant. And I have so much to say about this. I am going to do a part 3, and that is going to be on animal issues in Japan. specifically, because that's a whole separate issue. On our trips, we do connect with local activists, and so we do hear firsthand about the issues that are happening in Japan. We know some of them, obviously, wherever you are, if you're an animal activist, if you're an animal advocate. But we do talk to advocates who are on the ground, and that's really helpful because it's a very different culture than our Western United States, Western UK, Australia, wherever you are. It's a different place and it's a different culture. And there's a lot to say about that. And I will talk about that in part 3 when I'm talking about lobbying, which you don't really do as much in Japan, but more and more where you're just interacting with the officials. Yeah, it's its own place with its own culture and protocols. And we'll talk about that when we get to that topic. So I want to kick off this episode just talking about traveling as a vegan, or if you're plant-based or whatever you are, because it's so interesting to me. This whole experience I have been having over the last 26 years, 30 years, more than that, being an animal advocate, it's like an anthropological experiment, because it's just really interesting to see how people respond to me being vegan. And especially when I talk to people about, well, all of it, eating out, travel, all of it. And specifically around travel, I am so interested in how we people view food, and view food through the lens of not eating animal products. Because for me, and it's not just because I'm vegan. Okay, maybe it is because I'm vegan. The point is, there is a lens through which we can look at everything. And that is going to determine how we experience things. And so I'm saying this because David and I were up in Sonoma County over the weekend. We were up at one of our favorite wineries, and it was a pickup party because we're members of this particular winery. And in fact, I will be there in a couple days for my birthday. We're going to meet some friends up there and have a picnic lunch and have some wine. And by the way, it's Limerick Lane. I'm not trying to keep the name from you. It's one of my favorite wineries, and they just make some of the best zins if you're a California Zinfandel lover like we are. And we were up there for a pickup party. So we were meeting strangers, and I love meeting strangers. I love talking to strangers. And we went up there for a pickup party. So obviously, inevitably, we're going to be talking to people we don't know. And of course, it comes up. The work that I do comes up in conversation. Now, before it came up that I was vegan, we were talking to a retired couple we were talking about travel, and we started talking about travel kind of right off the bat. And after about 20 minutes into our conversation, just about traveling in general, different places we like to go and that they like to go, we got to the place where it came out that David and I host trips around the world. And again, it wasn't clear that we were vegan. We hadn't said that yet. And so they were very fascinated and interested in the fact that we, take groups of people and host them and get to have this incredible experience, because we do, getting to travel around the world and bring people with us. And so they asked for my card. The wife asked for my card. And as I was giving it to her, I didn't say this apologetically or embarrassingly, but I did say, just so you know, they're vegan trips. So I'm not sure if you'd be interested in that. And I said that because she was eating dairy-based cheese while they were drinking their wine. So I got the sense that they weren't vegan. That was my amazing, investigative work. So I said that to her, but by then we had already developed a rapport, right? I mean, this is what this looks like. By then we had already developed a rapport. And so when I said, I don't know if that's something you're going to be interested in, she says, well, I don't know. We might be interested in it. We eat plant-based or whatever she said. I don't think she said that, but she said, we might be interested in that. And then it kind of just turned into kind of group travel and how, people really love having things taken care of for them. And they, kind of agreed on that point. But we started then talking about the travel that we do, the different parts around the world, and how hard it is, quote unquote, or how easy it is, quote unquote, for us to find food in the places we travel to. Now, what's interesting to me is we started off with Italy. And as you know, from the 4-part series I did on the cuisine of Italy, which is really the cuisines of the regions of Italy, I started in southern Italy, moved to central Italy, took Tuscany out on its own, which is also, which is central Italy, and then did northern Italy. For me, Italy is one of the easiest places. It's just one of the places that just where you just find the food that is of the people and of the history. And I have said this about every country. Every country's foundation is plants, period, full stop. Meat has been a luxury item since it became part of our regular repertoire. It has only been a regular part of our repertoire as humans for the last, I would say, 100 or so years. That's a really short span of time considering how long we've been around as Homo sapiens. And so, when I answer this question, it's very easy for me to say, oh, you can find vegan food. It's very easy. I don't want to say that because I want to shift the paradigm, which is, well, of course, the food that is available in Italy, there's so many plant-based options because that's the foundation of their cuisine. And I could say that about every country we go to, truly. And so as soon as I said that about Italy, I love using the example of the pizza just because it just hammers home the idea that even the pizza that everyone thinks about with cheese and meat and all the things, the original pizza was quote unquote vegan. It was plant-based because it was only with marinara sauce, and that we can go to any restaurant in Italy and a pizza restaurant at least, and every pizzeria will have a marinara pizza on their menu. We don't have to ask for a margarita pizza with no cheese. It is by default marinara, which is obviously with no cheese. And so I use that as an example because I want to shift the paradigm for people to understand that this is the foundation. Now, when you travel these days and it's all about luxury and it's all about having all of the meat and the dairy and all of the seafood and all of it, people say that they want the experience of the places they're going to, but they don't really. They want the experience that's going to be as familiar as possible, So people are eating American cuisine in a lot of these places as well. Fast food, unfortunately, even when they're traveling. And so if you really want the experience, the authentic experience of these places, then go eat the food that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and most of that will be plant foods. So they said Italy, I said, yeah, of course, did my spiel, and then we mentioned Japan, and they go, well, how about Japan? I go, yeah, Japan's actually a lot harder, because it is. And so I also said that with a caveat, though, because again, when you're looking in one direction your whole life, and you are traveling, you are looking through the lens of a non-vegan. You're looking through the lens of a meat eater. And so if you're not looking for it, you don't know that it's there. And that's one of the things I wanted to impress upon them. The other thing I, didn't have time for because I just did an entire episode on it that you could listen to anytime, which is part 1 of Vegan in Japan, is that, Japan has the shortest history of meat consumption of any country in the world because of its unique history. And you can go back and listen to more about that in part 1. And so I said, yeah, look, there are plenty of vegetables in Japanese cuisine. There's plenty of grains. Of course, rice is a staple. I said, one of the things that makes it more difficult in Japan for someone who's vegetarian or vegan, not just vegan, but just vegetarian, is the fish sauce, is the bonito flakes, the fish flakes they put in all of their broths. Okay, that's solvable. There's temple cuisine and vegetarian cuisine, and in the big cities you're going to have vegan restaurants even, so that's not the issue. I said what some of the issues around doing our trips in Japan is actually the cultural barriers. This isn't about food. It's about they don't like large groups. They don't want to modify what they do for travelers, for Westerners. I mean, there's a lot going on that makes Japan a more difficult place for someone who's vegetarian or vegan. And it's not just because there aren't options. That's not the case at all. So that's what inspired me to kind of bump this episode up. Is I was talking to several different people. Even after that couple, we talked to another 2 young women who were there together as girlfriends, and we had another lovely conversation, and people really get it. People really get it when I say, I don't just say, yo, as a vegan, I figure it out. It's all good. I can make it work. I don't want that to be the narrative. The narrative is, yeah, of course we can find what we're looking for because plants are the foundation of that cuisine. And that goes for Japanese cuisine 100%. And so what I'm going to talk about today are the foods, the restaurants, the types of foods, the dishes, the the cuisine of this incredibly beautiful tiny country called Japan. And I'm going to share it in the context not of like, these are the restaurants you should go to in Japan. That would be so boring for me. Sure, I can write a post about that, or if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. But I'm going to talk about it in the context of, by the way, all these foods that I'm going to be naming on this episode, they are all familiar to you. Most of them will be. The dishes, the foods, the types of cuisine. They're going to mostly be familiar to you. Those that aren't, that's exciting. Isn't that fun? But mostly I'm going to be sharing with you, yeah, like this is food we already know. So for someone who goes, how do you eat vegan in Japan? I could literally rattle off, off the top of my head, 20 foods, 30 foods. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to rattle off, okay, but with a lot more interesting detail, the 30 foods and beverages that are already plant-based. Some of them I will talk about how they now add animal products. And so some that you want to ask for. And again, this goes for whether you're in the United States or the UK or Australia or, anywhere else in the world. I keep using those because those are my main listeners that I'm aware of, but I know that many of you are listening from Switzerland and from Sweden and from Germany. So I know you're elsewhere. I was also kind of prioritizing the English primary language, English speaking countries. So wherever you are, these are going to be things that you will find in Japanese restaurants, and what to maybe ask for, look for, just to make sure that you're not getting any animal products and fish sauce and all of that. So I'll talk about that. But go back and listen to part 1 if you want kind of the foundation of vegetarianism in Japan and all of the ways that I think will be helpful to kind of frame this part 2 with. So let's start with the most common Japanese dishes that you are familiar with, because you will find them in Japanese restaurants around the world, and they are prevalent in Japan as well. I think in the Italian series, it was a little more obvious to talk about Italian cuisine and Italian American cuisine. Really, by the time the dishes are brought to the United States from native Japanese, they're kind of keeping the tradition still. You don't have a lot of differences except for probably more meat, but there's plenty of meat in Japan. So anyway, the point is you're going to be familiar with all of these, and there's not a real shift from whether you're eating these in Japan or whether you're eating these at a Japanese restaurant in whatever country you live in. So let us start with, and this is what I'm going to do too, because this is what I'm very interested in, is when I talk about the foundation of these foods, I'm also going to be talking about the foundation of the words and how even in the names of the words, the etymology of the words, like sushi, you have the fact that it is plant-based or just it's neutral. It's not like you say most people hear sushi and they think it means fish. No. So let's unpack the words as well to demonstrate that the foundation of these dishes that I'm going to be talking about are plant-based, both literally and etymologically. So let's start with the most famous. Let's start with sushi. Sushi just means vinegared rice. Comes from the Japanese terms su and shi from meshi. Together, these two words, vinegar and rice, means vinegared rice. That is the defining element of sushi, not raw fish, which is commonly presumed wrongly. And so what we can do when we're talking about this or thinking about this is just correct that because people, they make vegan sushi. No, sushi is by definition not fish. And so the key defining element is seasoned rice. And so since it's about vinegared rice, seasoned rice, then it's very obvious to, take the next step, which is, okay, what do you pair that with? for vegetarians and for vegans will be avocado, cucumber, tofu, pickled vegetables, obviously, and that's all authentically sushi. The point is that it is just as traditional to have plant-based sushi as it is to have sushi with animal flesh. Now, if you have been vegetarian or vegan for any length of time or even contemplating it, you could probably imagine that you go to any Japanese restaurant and you'll be able to find vegetarian options. I say vegetarian, not vegan, because I mean, they're obviously vegan. There wouldn't be, dairy in them, but for all intents and purposes, vegetarian, vegan sushi. And, they might be simple wherever you go, but goodness knows around the world, we have just incredible vegan sushi restaurants. We have Shizen here in San Francisco. We have Chaya in San Francisco. Actually, I think the San Francisco one closed, still in Berkeley. And of course, in New York City, you have Beyond Sushi, which is still probably my favorite. But around the world, we have that. And there's vegan sushi places in Japan as well. The point is, it's easy to find what you're looking for if you're looking for sushi, if you're vegan. When we did our trips last year, and by the way, we are definitely doing this again this year. I'm super excited. We had a sushi master make sushi for us. He is a young man. I mean, he cannot be more than 30. And the practice of learning sushi and making sushi, it really is a mastery. And David and I watched a documentary on sushi making because it has this long tradition. And I'm not even going to recommend the documentary because it was just very meat centric. However, I know that it is an arduous process to become a master sushi chef. Well, this young man who made this gorgeous sushi for us, he was trained as a sushi chef, traditional with fish. He went vegan and he retrained himself so that all of his food would be plant-based. And it's really inspiring. It's very rare. And his food was delicious and it was beautiful. And he was using the same principles that we have talked about for decades, which is it's fat and salt and texture and flavor and familiarity. And so whereas you might have a very soft piece of salmon, when you're making fish-based sushi, for him, he would use a very soft cut slice of roasted red pepper. So you're getting that texture, you're getting the color. And then again, depending on how you vinegar it or season it, you're getting the flavor and the familiarity. So he was just quite literally a master, and it was really incredible. So look around, look through the lens of what's possible and what's available that I haven't looked at before, and I bet you will find it. Now, when you're in a sushi restaurant, you're going to have different types of sushi, and knowing just a few words in Japanese, which will be present on the menus, no doubt, will help you. So there's 3 different things that you would typically see on a sushi menu. One would be nigiri. And nigiri, just the word means to grasp or to squeeze. And that refers to how this style of sushi is hand pressed into an oval shape. This is what we would watch this master do. It was amazing. Before being topped with the vegetables, with the ingredients. That's what nigiri means. Nigiri just means there's that little boat, right? That little oval shape of rice, and then you put the toppings on top. That's what nigiri means. Then you have maki, and maki are all the rolls. I was going to say the rolled sushi. It's the rolls. And so this is rolled sushi with rice and then fillings, and it's usually wrapped in seaweed. And maki means to roll. So that should just help you kind of remember that maki, any kind of maki you get, would be a roll. Now, of course, you're going to want to make sure that it's vegetarian ingredients inside. And then another type of sushi rice dish is inari. And you've all seen this. It's sushi rice, which is that, kind of stickier rice, stuffed into sweet tofu pouches. Inari refers to the Shinto god of rice and fertility and prosperity. And so inari sushi is usually just, I've never, ever seen inari not be suitable for vegans. So inari sushi is just the vinegared rice stuffed inside of the little sweet tofu pouch. And I love inari. Delicious, simple, yum. Yes, sashimi means thinly sliced raw fish. That's sashimi. That's different. It actually isn't technically sushi because there's no vinegared rice. So sashimi is its own thing. And you know what sashimi means? It means to pierce or stab. Sashi means pierce or stab, and mi is body or flesh. Boo, we don't like sashimi. So my point is actually sashimi, just fish, is not really even sushi. Another dish you will see, this is going to be familiar to everyone listening, is edamame. Edamame are the young green soybeans. So edamame are soybeans, but they're the young green soybeans that are harvested before the beans are fully mature. They are a staple in Japanese cuisine. They are typically boiled or steamed in the pod and lightly salted, making them a wonderful snack. You will often see edamame as an appetizer in izakayas, which are Japanese pubs. We're going to talk about izakayas in a bit, or alongside meals. And they're always also naturally vegan unless you go to some place and they're using some kind of maybe dressing that has the bonito flakes, that has the fish sauce on them. So just ask, but most places wouldn't. Most places just serve them kind of on their own with salt or not. And you can then just dip them into, like a tamari. Now, we did talk about tempura. I feel like I would have talked about tempura somewhere else. Maybe I did it on social media. But tempura is actually really interesting because the word tempura actually has its roots in the Latin word tempora, meaning times or seasons. And we've talked a number of times in this podcast about how different Christian holidays and high holy days have impacted our words in the English language because so many of them have to do with fasting. And when I say fasting, I mean abstaining from meat. And so this has impacted a lot of the words in the English language. I'll talk about another one in a second, but tempora is one of them because the ember days on the Christian liturgical calendar were when Catholics traditionally abstained from eating meat. So tempora, meaning times, would refer to that time. Now, in the 16th century, Portuguese Jesuit missionaries arrived in Japan, and they brought with them that custom of fasting, of not eating meat during Lent. And so to adhere to their abstinence from meat, these missionaries developed a method of batter frying vegetables, which resembled the fritter-style dishes that they were accustomed to back in Portugal. And that's why they're called tempura. So tempura has always meant not meat. Like tempura has always been tied up with vegetarian cuisine. Now, technically speaking, some tempura batters will have eggs in them today. That's not necessarily traditional, but just so you know, that's something you might want to ask. But I am making the point that tempura has been and started off as being vegetarian, vegan, suitable for vegans. The other word I was alluding to before is the word carnival. Carnival is a word that is made up of carne and vale, which means farewell to meat. And that was a word that originally referred to the festive period, was carnivale, that referred to the festive period preceding the Christian season of Lent, Carnival, we call it today, during which people would indulge in feasting and merrymaking, right? That's what Carnival was, because they were about to start fasting and abstaining from meat. So Carnival, tempura, both of which have to do with the periods in the Christian calendar where people would be abstaining from meat. So that's another dish that you would find that would be mostly vegetables, and just ask about the batter. The next dish that's already familiar to you is miso. Miso is made from grains and soybeans fermented with salt and koji, which is a fungus, a starter. I have been making miso myself, and it is incredibly satisfying. You just basically make it. It's so easy to make, and then you just tuck it away, and you can either ferment it for 3 months or 6 months or a year. And the longer you ferment it, the darker it is and the stronger their taste. And that's why you have light miso, yellow miso, red miso. It really just depends on how long you ferment it. And so miso soup obviously is probably one of the most famous and international ways that people are familiar with miso, but of course it can and is also wonderful to be made into a dressing that can be used for salads, that can be used for steamed vegetables, roasted vegetables. And so there are just hundreds of different varieties of miso in Japan. So if you want kind of the samurai level experience of miso, then you will want to go and just spend time in Japan. But it's obviously something you can find anywhere and everywhere here in the United States. Also incredibly beneficial for you in terms of the probiotics and the amino acids and the vitamins. Just really delicious. I keep miso on hand all the time because, even if you aren't making a miso soup, it's a wonderful base for any soup because it's going to add that umami flavor. It's going to add that saltiness, and it's just really delicious. And when I say samurai, it was considered a samurai superfood. Like samurai warriors apparently carried dried miso balls around with them for quick nutrition on the battlefield. So you can be a proper samurai and have miso balls. And of course, miso is by definition plant-based. Okay, moving on to the next category because I want to talk about noodles. Udon, soba, ramen. These are three of Japan's most iconic noodles, and guess what? They are all by default plant-based. I say this all the time, and I said this a lot in the Italy episodes. By definition, they are plant-based. Same with pasta in Italy. However, there are some cases where chicken's eggs are added, especially in the north of Italy. When we're talking about the noodles here, the udon, the soba, the ramen, you will want to check, but for the most part, and I will be happy to give you my recommendations for brands. If you want to just send me ping me for my favorite brands for especially ramen noodles, but you can absolutely find the plant-based versions, but traditionally, they really were just already plant-based. They were already vegan. And so let's start with soba. Soba dates back to the Edo period. The Edo period was the period just before the modernization of Japan, which kind of came around 1868. So 1603, 1868 is the Edo period. And so you had buckwheat cultivation in Japan earlier than that, but you started having buckwheat ground into flour and made into dumplings and then eventually made into noodles. Became very popular in Tokyo, very nutritious, very quick to prepare, and just delicious. But what was the grain that came to Japan even earlier than buckwheat? That would have been wheat. So wheat came from China. Udon dates back to about 1,000 years ago, at least by 1100. So close to 1,000 years, where udon became a staple in Japanese cuisine, especially Western Japan, where wheat was more readily available than buckwheat. And so soba masters undergo intense training, just like the sushi masters, taking years to perfect the skill of hand cutting soba to their uniform thinness. We do go to a soba restaurant when we are in Japan. And I will talk to you also about the toppings and the broths for both udon, soba, and now ramen, because yes, the noodles may already be plant-based, but there's also the considerations of the toppings and the broths. So let's just get to ramen before we talk about the differences between the three of them. So ramen, I really could have and should have done an episode just on ramen, but I'm just going to include it here with soba and udon. For all intents and purposes, let's just say I am in love with ramen, and I wasn't before we went to Japan. And this is just one of the things I love about travel is it opens your worlds up, and it did for me. Remember what I talked about Vietnam when we went to Vietnam? I never ate pho because my association with pho was that it was just meat. And so when we, of course, had our vegan trip to Vietnam, And we worked with all of the vendors and restaurateurs and chefs who made, pho without animal products. I fell in love with pho. And now, like wherever we go, any Vietnamese restaurant around us, we're in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are a lot. We can find vegetarian pho in a lot of places. Some are better than others, so it's kind of fun to just look around for your favorites. And we've done the same thing with ramen. Not only am I making ramen at home now, there are so many ramen restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I will say that it's not like every ramen shop has vegan options, and that's the case in the United States, and it's definitely the case in Japan. But I jump ahead. Let's talk about what ramen means. So in Chinese, the word main, M-E-I-N, well, at least spelled phonetically in using English letters, main means noodles, right? And so it's a versatile term used to describe a wide variety of noodle types and dishes in Chinese cuisine. So you've heard it combined with chow mein, which means stir-fried noodles, or lo mein, which is tossed noodles. And this leads us to the roots of Japanese ramen, which can be traced back to China. The exact origin of the word ramen remains uncertain, but it is commonly believed that it derives from two Chinese characters, ra and men. So ra meaning stretch, and as you've probably figured out, men meaning noodle. So that's not a huge leap for the men part of ramen, but there's not 100% certainty, but most likely stretched noodle. And wheat-based noodles made their way to Japan during the late 19th to early 20th centuries, likely brought by Chinese immigrants. But the Japanese took these noodles and ran with them. That's one thing we've talked about, is that Japan is very good at adopting and adapting elements from other cultures and then incorporating them into their own traditions, and sometimes even improving upon them. I mentioned this in part 1. Non-food examples are Buddhism from India by way of China and Korea, baseball from the United States, the Japanese writing system whose characters came from China, and I'm not going to lie, but toilets. I mean, they took the Western countries' toilets and they innovated them, and they took toilets to a whole other level. We have a Japanese toilet at home in one of our bathrooms, and we have friends who they just will talk about our toilet when they come for parties or dinners, because it's really amazing. And until you go to Japan and experience the toilet, I'm not kidding you, you just don't know. But food-wise, ramen, along with tofu, rice, tea, it's a perfect example of the Japanese adopting a dish from China, specifically from China in this case, and making it their own. So ramen was a Chinese-inspired noodle soup, and it was known before World War II, but it evolved in the post-war era into its modern form. And so today we have 4 main types of ramen broth. So you're always going to find the ramen noodles. Some will have chicken's eggs, so just make sure. Sometimes it's kind of hard because you might find authentic ramen noodles with just Japanese characters and it's hard to read, but let me know if you want a suggestion. But when we're talking about the broth, you have 4 different types of broth. You have shoyu, which is soy sauce. We're going to talk about shoyu. You have miso, which is the fermented soybean paste, and you have shio, which is salt. Now you also have one called tonkotsu, which is pork bone, and that is not for us. But that's the point, is that the tonkotsu is all about the fat and the salt. And pigs, don't make fat and salt. Fat and salt come from plants, plant oils, plant fats, salt, etc. And so you get the much sought after, rich, salty umami flavors in plant-based broths by using kombu, which is a seaweed, mushrooms, plant-based milks, and miso, for instance. So ramen has always been a dish that chefs play with. It's kind of one of the characteristics of ramen, is that chefs kind of play with the ingredients and then make their own versions. So by definition, it's just as traditional to make plant-based versions of ramen without animal fat and without animal fluids, because that is the point of ramen. It's fluid. So the shoyu ramen I mentioned is made with shoyu, which is a soy sauce. The miso tends to be made with miso paste, often includes things like tofu and corn and greens. And then you have the shio, which is a lighter, clearer broth. And that's often made with the kombu, some vegetables. And there is a vegan tonkatsu, and it's made with plant-based milk. And if you can go find tonkatsu, like wherever there's a ramen shop near you, go have it. Because it was the first ramen I had, actually, when we were in Japan at a place called, what is it called? Like Vegan Teas or something like that. Tea. Okay, I'm blanking on the name. If you want the name of restaurants, you're just going to have to ping me separately. But it's amazing. So it's really rich. There's a sesame cashew cream along with the vegetable broth, mushrooms, vegetables, all the things. So those are the 4 different types. My favorite, when we're in Japan or not, is the miso ramen. And so those are the components of ramen: your noodles, your broth, and then your toppings. And the toppings are a big deal. For the plant-based toppings, we have our tofu, mushroom, bamboo shoots, corn, greens might also be there. Sometimes sesame seeds, sometimes green onions, sometimes nori. And so those are the things you're going to want to look for to make sure they are suitable for you as a joyful vegan. Ramen shops are just all over Japan, and I just love going into these really, really simple, bare bones places. You barely speak. You ask for what you want. It's like one of 3 options: the shio, the miso, or the shoyu. Slurping is absolutely acceptable. It's considered rude to place your chopsticks in the bowl of ramen while you're eating it, so you just rest them on the rim of the bowl. Bean sprouts are common in ramen, so I'm not a fan of bean sprouts, and it was something that I learned very quickly, was to, whenever I ordered ramen, was to ask for the ramen without bean sprouts. They were totally fine making me the ramen without bean sprouts. And in Tokyo, there are 10,000 ramen shops. Fewer than 10 of them have vegan options. So we've got our work cut out for us. So go there, find your vegan ramen shops, or your shops that have vegan options, and have at it. I want to recommend 2 movies about ramen that I think will help you understand the culture that is ramen. One of them is Tampopo. You may have already seen it. It's a 1985 classic Japanese film. It's often described as a ramen Western as opposed to a spaghetti Western. Get it? And it does have that feel. It explores the quest for the perfect bowl of ramen through a series of comedic and heartwarming vignettes. I will warn you, there's definitely like animal product crap, which you might not like. So if you don't even ever look at movies that have any meat, or there's one scene with a turtle that I did close my eyes and look away from, but I'm telling you, like, the movie just helped me really understand ramen. Then there's there's a documentary, that's a feature film. Then there's a documentary called Come Back Anytime. It was made in 2021. And it follows the story of Masamoto Ueda, who's an aging ramen master who has a ramen shop in Tokyo. And he's run this ramen shop for decades. And it basically, it's not even about the ramen itself. There's moments where it shows kind of how he makes it. And again, you're just going to have to ignore the bones. But it captures the close-knit community that has formed around his ramen shop, and just the warmth and the camaraderie. It's just so sweet, and I really recommend it. So that's called Come Back Anytime. So that's your soba, your udon, and your ramen. Next, we have another Japanese dish I'm sure you're familiar with, and that is gyoza. And gyoza is just essentially dumplings, Japanese dumplings. In fact, gyoza means dumpling. They're typically filled with vegetables, sometimes also, cabbage, vegetables, what have you. Sometimes you're going to find, gyoza that has animal meat, but it's not difficult at all to find gyoza made with vegetables. Sometimes they are pan-fried, sometimes they are steamed, sometimes they're boiled, and they're just wonderful. Is there anything better than fried dumplings? The answer is no. You dip them in some soy sauce and they're just so fantastic. They could just be a meal or they could be a side dish. In fact, I think is it Trader Joe's that has like a really good dumpling, has a really good gyoza if you're interested in just getting some right off the shelf. This is definitely something. I do not make dumplings myself. Someday maybe I will, but I do not now. So if I were to get gyoza other than at a restaurant, which I don't really, but I remember Trader Joe's does have a really delicious gyoza. Okay, moving on to another category, and that's sea vegetables. Nori, kombu, and hijiki are kind of the most well-known, I would say. Kombu, you've heard of, no doubt. It's used for making soup stock, and it's wonderful because it's a wonderful dashi soup stock without the bonito flakes. So you get, again, that umami, that saltiness. And you've also probably heard of kombu being really helpful for kind of soaking up, if you will, the sugars when beans are soaking to make them have less of that sugar that creates gas in people when they eat the beans. So kombu is good to add to beans when they're cooking and soaking. Then you have hijiki. I can't say hijiki is my favorite. It tends to be that really dark, stringy seaweed that, is typically simmered in a soy sauce, served with carrots or tofu. Very high in nutrition. It's a lot of minerals, obviously being a sea vegetable, calcium and the iron, etc. But I don't tend to love hijiki. The other favorite I would say, I didn't say I was going to include this, but I'm going to just include it off the top of my head, and that's wakame. I do like wakame. I do like a wakame salad. Wakame is just another sea vegetable that is green, and it's just wonderful, all chopped up and just, added like carrots and sesame oil and vinegar. I do like a wakame. I do like a wakame salad. So for any of these, again, you're just going to want to ask whether you're in Japan or in a Japanese restaurant, if there is bonito fish stock or fish flakes, you're just going to want to ask. Next, tamari. You've heard of tamari, a Japanese staple, probably in your home. It's my preferred type of soy sauce. It's a type of Japanese soy sauce that stands out for its rich umami flavor and its unique production process. What's really interesting about tamari is that it's actually a byproduct of miso making. It is the liquid byproduct. It's what happens like when the soybean mixture is, thicker and heavier. As it's starting to ferment, the lighter liquid will rise to the top. And that's what you get. That's how you get tamari. We actually made tamari when we were making our miso. You can just pour it out from the top and continue fermenting your miso, but that's where tamari comes from. And the word actually means to accumulate. It comes from the verb tamaru, meaning to accumulate, referring to the method I just mentioned. And so in addition to tamari, you also have shoyu. We mentioned shoyu a little bit before. It's a soy sauce. It's brewed with a combination of soybeans and wheat. Tamari is traditionally made almost entirely just from soybeans. That should tip you off thinking of miso. There's no wheat in miso. That's why tamari tends to be wheat-free. However, some commercial tamaris might have wheat, so if you are allergic, you want to check that. But shoyu is just like a regular soy sauce, traditionally made with a combination of soybeans and wheat, and then tamari is made almost entirely from soybeans. It's a bit thicker, it's a bit darker, it's a bit smoother, a little less salty, and it happens to be my favorite. How both of these differ from Chinese soy sauce, they're just lighter. They just have a better balance of sweet and savory. In my opinion, I'm just not a huge fan of Chinese soy sauce. So yeah, at home, we mostly have tamari, though we have some shoyu as well. I shouldn't say this. That's a complete lie. David makes a lot of Asian noodle dishes, and he has a number of different Chinese soy sauces. He has like a light soy sauce and a dark soy sauce, and they're all Chinese. I don't tend to love Chinese cuisine. I know that's a massive generalization, but I don't. And so he's the one who tends to use all of those different kinds of Chinese soy sauces. I don't tend to make those dishes, so that's why I said we don't have Chinese soy sauces because I don't. David does. He does. He has his own shelf of like Chinese sauces and chili sauces and all that kind of thing. So anyway, tamari, shoyu, etc. I want to pause here and talk about the word umami because I've mentioned it a few times now. And I want to talk about what it is because it's a word that we throw around a lot today. And it is a word that comes from the Japanese term umai, meaning delicious or savory, combined with the word mi, meaning taste. That probably still doesn't tell you much about what it means. But the term was first coined by Dr. Ikeda, a Japanese chemist, in 1908. And he identified a distinct flavor in a kombu dashi, so that kelp broth that we mentioned earlier. Kombu dashi just means broth. And so when he was identifying this flavor, he realized it didn't fit into the traditional categories of the sweet, the sour, the salty, or the bitter. And so he found that glutamic acid, which is a naturally occurring amino acid in foods like seaweed, tomatoes, mushrooms, aged cheeses, which can go for plant-based cheeses as well, was responsible for this deep, savory richness. So if you're going to think about what umami means and trying to describe it to someone, I would say a deep, savory richness. Like that's literally what it is. Unlike other tastes that are detected on very specific parts of the tongue, umami is perceived like throughout the mouth. And it creates this really long-lasting, mouth-watering sensation. It's often described as brothy or meaty, which I think applies for us, even those of us who don't eat animal meat, deeply savory. That's really the best way I think about it. And that's the reason why you have ingredients like miso and soy sauce and tamari and mushrooms and fermented foods are really satisfying. So that concept of umami that's been in Japanese cuisine, it's always existed. I mean, that's the foundation of Japanese cuisine is the dashi broths, the misos, the soy-based seasonings, the fermented foods, right? But it wasn't until Ikeda's discovery and later scientific validation that umami was officially recognized as the fifth basic taste by the scientific community. And so that's why you'll hear about it today. It has universal understanding as a taste experience, sweet, sour, bitter, and salty, and now umami as well. So let's move on to some other more familiar plant-based by default Japanese foods, ending with some drinks, ending with some sweet things, ending with a couple more cuisines that I want to talk about within Japanese cuisine, and ending with my favorite discovery in Japan, bar none. And finding a vegan version here in the United States has been tricky, but I cannot wait to share that with you because it was a game changer. I want to say it was like the ramen in Japan and the pho in Vietnam, but that's not true because I had associations with those two foods that were altered because of my experience of them in those countries, obviously as a vegan. The food that I am going to share with you, I had no association. I had never heard of it before, and we had it on our trips, and we're going to have it again, and I'm trying to find vegan versions of it here. I can make it at home. I haven't done it yet. It will be easy to make at home. I just haven't done it yet. But before we continue with that, I just want to thank Plain Products, our sponsor today, supplementing our listener supporters. Plain Products is amazing. They have an incredible line of refillable, zero-waste hair and body care products so that you can care for your hair and care for your body and your skin, and you do not leave behind a trail of plastic waste. The thing that I love the most is they're one of their newest products, and that's their Cherry Almond Deep Conditioner. Just going to say it's heaven. It smells like heaven. It takes care of the moisture that my unruly head of hair needs. And I love their regular conditioner as well, but I love their Cherry Almond Deep Conditioner. But they also have body lotions, body washes. They have face washes and face lotions. They have hair repair. They have now a hair styling gel. So they have a lot of different products. And if you are interested at any time getting a Plain product, because once you use it, you send it back, they wash out your bottle, they refill it, they send it to other customers. They have an entire closed loop system, which is incredibly sustainable. Everything's vegan, everything's cruelty free, completely zero waste. And at any time, you can get their products by using the link at joyfulvegan.com. It's on the homepage. You will have no trouble finding it. And you use the word compassion as your code. I think in the last episode, I said joyful vegan. Now you can use either because I made the mistake and I thought, oh no, what if someone goes over and puts in joyful vegan and it doesn't work? Now it will work, but compassion was the original code. Use either one with the link that's at joyfulvegan.com and you will get 20% off every single time you order whatever products you order. So thank you so much, Plain Products. I cannot recommend them highly enough. So where were we? Oh yes, familiar Japanese foods. I am going to share my favorite. This isn't the favorite that I discovered that I will talk about when we were in Japan. This is a favorite, has been a favorite of mine for decades, and that is tofu. It's been a staple in Japan for centuries. It is associated with vegetarians and vegans in the United States because it was brought to the United States through macrobiotics and through a Japanese macrobiotic practitioner. And yet it has been a staple in Japan for centuries. So once again, it was introduced to Japan from China during the Nara period, which was about 710 to 794. So pretty early on, Buddhist monks brought the technique for making tofu, and it quickly became an essential protein, especially in the Shojin Rori cuisine, which is the Buddhist temple cuisine, and that emphasizes plant-based eating. Over time, tofu became widely embraced across Japan, not just in temples, but in everyday home cooking, hot pots, street food, and even fine dining. I love tofu so much. And it might not surprise you to hear that I make my own tofu, not every day because I eat a lot of tofu, but a lot. I do love making tofu. And tofu is very simple. It is soy milk. It is basically a cheese making method. It is taking milk, in this case, milk made from beans, which has also been around for a very long time. You curdle. Oh, does that sound familiar? Just like when you're making a dairy-based cheese. And then you press it into solid blocks. Depending on the coagulant you use to curdle it, you get different textures and different flavors. So that is it in a nutshell. You start with dried soybeans that are soaked. You blend them with water. You boil and strain that to produce the soy milk. And then you add a coagulant. And that coagulant, depending on which kind you use, will make either a firm or an extra firm or a silken. The coagulant matters in terms of the type of tofu, but so does the amount of water that you press out or don't press out. The firm and extra firm obviously are great because they keep their shape well. They're great for salads, like making a big old tofu salad, like an eggless egg salad, or for air frying or grilling or baking or stir frying. And that's tofu. Silken tofu is great for, making creamy dressings, creamy desserts. One of the best hacks that I have been talking about for, decades, but, now it's very popular and I'm glad it's popular. It's just like podcasting. I've been doing podcasting for 18 years. Now everybody has a podcast. Glad for that. And been there. So my favorite tofu hack is freezing a block of tofu. Not silken. But you take a block of firm or extra firm tofu and you freeze it. You can freeze it up to 6 months and then you thaw it. And when you thaw it, once you thaw it, you squeeze out all the water. And in squeezing out all the water, you create this spongy, drier texture. And you also enable it to be soaked with another kind of liquid marinade and sauces. So that's the whole point. And so it's really great to crumble and put into a chili or crumble and put into a pasta sauce. I just love eating it with salt and nutritional yeast. It's one of my favorite things to do. But it is actually a thing that's been done for a very long time in Japanese cuisine. And it has a name. It's called koya tofu. And that means frozen tofu. It's named after Mount Koya, so koya tofu. And Buddhist monks in this region, unintentionally developed it by leaving tofu out in the winter cold. That's at least the story. And that freezing, the process removes the moisture and it gives it that meatier, chewier texture, which is so fantastic. And it's great in a miso soup. It's great just marinated. Anyway, so koya tofu is what is the name for that frozen thawed tofu. Super high in protein. I'm going to be talking about protein soon. I'm going to be talking about my consumption of soy, which has increased, and my consumption of protein, which has increased. I'll talk about those in future episodes. And so stay tuned. And I'm going to be putting a lot of these different notes also in my Substack. So please, once again, consider becoming a subscriber over at Substack and join me over there for lots of conversation and content. The word tofu, by the way, comes from Chinese. It was adopted into Japanese with the same characters and pronunciation. You'll often hear dofu in Chinese, but it tends to be tofu in Japanese. And the word to or do means bean, and the word fu means curdled. So once again, plant-based food, you've heard of it, and it is by default for vegans. Another soy-based food that comes from the soy milk making process is yuba. Not everyone's heard of yuba. I wish yuba became more popular. I love yuba. I haven't really succeeded in making it at home, mostly because once I make a soy milk, I then want to curdle it so I can make tofu. And I haven't really made yuba successfully, and certainly not in the quantities that I would want to enjoy this food. It's basically the skin that forms on the top of a pot of boiling soy milk. And it's chewy and it's delicious, and you can stir fry it and you can put it in soups and stews. It's really elastic. It is so delicious. And if you are looking for a brand, if you can get Hodo is a tofu making company in Oakland. I think they have international distribution now. I know that they're at Whole Foods, for instance. They're on the pricier side, so I don't tend to buy their tofu, even though their tofu is absolutely delicious. And I don't buy their soy milk because I make it myself all the time. But I will buy Hodo Yuba because it's just so incredible. I absolutely love it if you haven't tried it. There's one more tofu-like dish. This is going to be a little less familiar to you, and that is goma tofu, which is sesame tofu, which is not actually tofu. So you're not actually using soybeans, you're using sesame seeds. So I can't say much more about that because I haven't made it myself. But sesame tofu is called goma tofu in Japan, and we have it in Japan. It's often served with the Shojin Roi. It's a very difficult word to say fast, by the way. Ryori cuisine. That's the temple cuisine, and it tends to be part of the temple cuisine. So we did have a good amount of sesame tofu, which I love. I just haven't made it home, and you probably haven't really had it unless you've had temple cuisine. Now, before we leave soybeans, I have to talk about one food that is a traditional Japanese food. You've probably heard of it. You may not have had it, and I'm saying this because I've tried it and I just cannot stand it because I cannot deal with the texture, and that's natto. Natto is fermented soybeans. It's made from fermented soybeans, and it has a very sticky texture and a very strong aroma, very umami-rich flavor. I have been told I don't love it. Lots of health benefits being a fermented food. It's typically eaten for breakfast. I think I've seen natto I may have seen natto in one of our temple meals when we were in Japan, but not a fan, but it is an essential part of Japanese food culture. Another food that has been part of Japanese food culture for over 1,000 years is mochi. Mochi dates back over 1,000 years when it was considered a food of the gods and eaten during religious rituals and celebrations. In fact, the word mochi comes from the Japanese verb motsu, meaning to hold or to have, symbolizing good fortune. And the process of pounding glutinous rice, because that's all mochi is, it is a really sticky, glutinous, sweet rice. You pound it. This is the traditional way to make mochi. You pound it until you basically get this like elastic dough, and then you can shape it into whatever shapes you want. And I can tell you exactly how it's made traditionally because we do this on our trips. We are at a restaurant, and the owner of the restaurant, her husband actually grows rice for mochi makers, and they have a traditional mortar and pestle. When I say mortar and pestle, it's basically like a massive bowl with a massive sledgehammer, and you just pound and pound and pound and pound until you get this like sticky dough. And that's what you do. And it's kind of amazing to watch the rice turn into a dough just from pounding it. Now, commercially, it's done it's done commercially with machines, and it's a lot smoother, but It's pretty fun to do. I can't say you can do this at home because you probably don't have a massive mortar and pestle. But those who are listening, I know who were with us in Japan, I know really enjoyed that process. Now, when you're getting mochi from a commercial place, you're going to want to look for, unfortunately, dairy products. It's really unfortunate. We used to go to a tea place in Berkeley called Teance before I got my tea from Far Leaves, which is where I still get all my tea. And by the way, if you want to get the tea that I love from farleaves.com, you can use my name, Colleen, anytime you order and you get a 10% discount. I use it all the time. And so before I started going to Far Leaves, and this is now, I've been going to Far Leaves for, 10, 15 years, but we used to go to Teance. We started going to Teance right when we moved to the Bay Area, so almost 25 years ago. And it is, it's a wonderful place. The owner died and it was very sad. It's very sad that she died. Teance, I think, they're still making tea, but they don't have the same tea bar that they had when Winnie was alive. But we used to go for tea tastings, and her friend used to come in who made handmade mochi sweets, like little treats. And they were so amazing. She was Japanese, her friend, and they were absolutely amazing. So I couldn't wait to go to Japan and have like traditional mochi, and we did. And even in Japan, you will find eggs in some of the batter, which is crazy, or in some of the fillings. But you will find plenty that don't have animal products. You can ask. So a couple of the favorites that was really fun, Bridie turned me on to one of her favorites when she first went and scouted, which is daifuku. Daifuku actually is a mochi, which is your standard mochi with sweet fillings, like an anko, a sweet red bean paste. The daifuku is actually, that's what like your standard is the mochi with the sweet fillings, but there's an ichigo daifuku, which is with strawberry. So you have a whole strawberry in with the mochi and in with the red bean paste. It is absolutely delightful. And then there's another really famous Japanese sweet made from mochi, which is called yatsuhashi. And it's really famous in Kyoto. And it's typically flavored with cinnamon. But there are now other variations. It's a very popular souvenir in Kyoto. And so it's like triangle shaped. And you will find chocolate, you will find matcha, you will find the cinnamon variety, which is banana was one. And actually a lot of these were already vegan. I have to say, I probably ate them to the point of getting sick. I ate a lot of the yatsuhashi, but they were absolutely delicious. And I took some home as gifts for people because they really do make lovely gifts. And so also one of the things on our trips that we do is one of the choose your own adventure activities you can do is learning to make your own little mochi sweets. I want to say it's not just mochi sweets. The tradition of making Japanese sweets, wagashi is the Japanese sweets, and they often include mochi. But that's one of the activities that a lot of people did on our previous trip. I did not do, and I can't wait to do. I'm signed up for it. And then when I got home from Japan last time, we had over Steve and Liz, if you're listening, Liz, because they were with us in Japan and we had become friends with them. I made I made ramen for them. And then I also found a place in San Francisco that makes these little Japanese sweets. And so I had them for us for our little Japanese lunch. So, again, once you're looking for these things, you'd be able to find them. But there's no better association for me than mochi, like a sweet with green tea. And I think it's because of that experience we had several times at Teance. So in honor of you, Winnie, we still enjoy our tea with mochi sweets. And speaking of tea, that would be another really familiar foodstuff beverage from Japan, and that's matcha. So matcha is a powdered green tea. And there are other green teas. I could talk about other green teas. But matcha is really special because it's part of the centuries-old tradition of tea ceremonies, which is, this meditative ritual originally brought to Japan by Zen Buddhist monks in the 12th century. Matcha specifically became central to this tea ceremony. It symbolizes mindfulness, symbolizes simplicity and respect. And unlike regular green tea, when the leaves are steeped and discarded, matcha is stone ground into this fine, gorgeous green powder, allowing you to consume the entire leaf and maximize its benefits. So you've got all the chlorophyll, the amino acids, the antioxidants. Green tea in general is just packed with antioxidants, but matcha in particular, you've got all of the antioxidants from the leaves as well, not just from the buds. And so it is one of my favorite things in the world is green tea, as you know. Sencha is another green tea. There's hojicha, there's gyokuro, there's so many. And when we were in Tokyo, it was really fun. We found a really amazing tea place and bought some gorgeous, gorgeous tea when we were there. And it was just amazing being in like a Japanese tea shop. I could have been there for hours and hours and hours. So that's matcha. So get yourself some matcha. Not just like, getting a matcha sweet drink from Starbucks or something. I think you can go get some beautiful matcha and make yourself some of your own matcha tea. Speaking of beverages, another very popular and traditional Japanese beverage is sake, which is made from fermented rice. Are you getting the sense that fermented foods is part of Japanese cuisine? So sake is a traditional Japanese rice wine made from fermented rice and water and yeast, and there's a koji mold. It's not really rice wine. It's really, the brewing process is closer to beer making because the starch is converted into sugar before fermentation, which is maybe why I don't love sake. There's certain foods that are fermented that I don't love, and I'm thinking the through line is this fermentation process at certain points in the process. Sake, sauerkraut, natto. What else? Kimchi. I like kimchi a little bit because it's spicy, but I don't tend to love, I just don't tend to, beer. I don't like beer, but I do like wine, which is fermented. And I do like tempeh, which is fermented. And I do like miso. So I think it depends on the mold. I don't know. I still haven't found that through line through some of the things that I don't love, but I don't love sake. And we were there in Kanazawa, which is kind of a smaller version of Kyoto, also in kind of the older part of Japan, where there's still a lot of old samurai houses, and there's also a geisha section. We did a sake tasting, and I just don't love it. I just didn't love it. Yeah. But it's been around for 1,000 years. Other people love it. It's enjoyed hot, it's enjoyed cold, it's enjoyed room temperature. The flavor profiles range from light and crisp to rich and umami forward. All the things. I just don't love it. Now, sake is naturally vegan. Some brands will use animal-derived fining agents during filtration. We have talked about this when it's related to wine. I have an entire episode on what makes wine vegan, organic, sustainable, natural, and I have my opinions about the filtration process, so you can make your own decision, but sake is for vegans. There's nothing that's animal derived in the final product. I will talk about one more liquid that I do love, and that is Japanese whiskey. Japanese whiskey, and I've never done an episode on whiskey. If you want me to do an episode on whiskey, let me know. But I do love my scotch, and I don't like American whiskey. I don't like bourbon. I do like Japanese whiskey because Japanese whiskey was modeled after Scottish whiskey making. So there's Irish whiskey. It's okay. I like Irish whiskey, but I don't love it. I like it. I love scotch, and that's what I love about Japanese whiskey is that it's inspired by Scottish whiskey making. So Japanese whiskey production began in the early 20th century. So it's not been around a very long time, but they have nailed it. Once again, they have nailed it. You had pioneers who were the founders of Nikka and Suntory. Those are two of the very well-known Japanese whiskey makers in Japan. What sets it apart, I don't know. It's just delicious. I'm not going to go into it. I'll do an episode on whiskey if you're ever interested. But it's just lighter profile. It's just not sweet like bourbon. Your single malt Japanese whiskey is going to be like Scottish whiskey. It's going to be made entirely from malted barley. For your blends, you might have some grains like corn or rye, but it's typically malted barley, and I prefer single malt. That's one of the reasons I don't love bourbon is because it's made from corn, not barley. And it's just a bit too sweet for me, so I don't love it. But it's just delicious. And if you are a whiskey drinker, if you like scotch, then maybe try and check out some Japanese whiskey, which you'll find all over Japan. And by the way, the other thing that's really popular in Japan is American jazz clubs, where you'll find just wonderful, that have wonderful whiskey menus. So American jazz was definitely brought out, obviously after the war, there were a lot of American, cultural things that moved over to Japan, and jazz clubs was one of them and remains. And we went to a really, really fun, famous jazz club when we were there at the end of our trip. So before I close, I just want to talk about a couple foods that you might be less familiar with. So I think you've heard of all of those foods. I know you have. I know you've heard of tofu. I know you've heard of miso and matcha and mochi and sea vegetables and tempura and ramen and udon and soba. You've heard of all of these things. And so when we're talking to folks who say like, oh my gosh, what do you eat in Japan? Huh? Plenty. Okay. But we need to kind of help reframe this because there's so many misconceptions. Sushi, as I said. So a couple of things that were fun to discover. And if you do go to Japan, you probably won't find these in the United States as much or wherever you are. But in Japan, there's street food. And so there are some street foods that, thanks to Bridie and Seb, World Vegan Travel, and their people on the ground, we discovered some really fun street snacks. One of them is roasted sweet potatoes, which they're kind of like caramelized and they're a bit sweet, but they are so delicious. They're sold from trucks in the winter especially, and it was a bit chilly when we were still there in early April. Naturally vegan, really delicious. So roasted sweet potatoes. Another street food I think we saw everybody walking around with, which was a little weird, was fruit on a stick, but candied, like candied fruit on a stick. So a lot of kids were walking around with like candied strawberries, candied whatever, just candy, like mango on a stick. So that was a thing. You will also find, which was kind of fun, street vendors selling fresh fruit. So that was definitely something we saw, even though there's a lot of junk food. And as I've already mentioned and alluded to, animal products in Japan, it was fun to see vendors selling just like fruit and smoothies. So you can find that in places around Japan as well. Another street food are rice crackers. So you've probably had rice crackers just because they've been Americanized. But rice crackers are also called senbei. They are made from the glutinous or non-glutinous rice, and they have been made for centuries. And it was really fun. We were at a ramen shop in Tokyo, and across the street was this like old traditional rice making shop that had been owned by the same family for like 6 generations. It was incredible. And so again, rice crackers, what else can I say? I mean, they're seasoned with soy sauce or seaweed or sesame. Some of them you're going to have to check. Sometimes they might have a fish-based seasoning or eggs or honey, so ask. But rice crackers are a thing that it's not just an Americanized thing that we like, oh, we like rice crackers. It's like a thing in Japan. And I absolutely love the rice crackers. Onigiri, I just wanted to mention the rice balls. Onigiri are the rice balls. These are also a Japanese staple that have been around for 1,000 years. If you just type in onigiri, Onigiri, rice balls, you will recognize them. Sometimes they're kind of triangular shaped. Sometimes they're just round. And often they're just either plain or they have like salted rice. Sometimes they have fillings like pickled plum or kombu, like a seasoned seaweed. And sometimes seaweed is around them. They are a snack food, but they're also a bento food. So I'll talk about bento boxes because that's something that's very unique to Japan, which was really fun. We did a bento box for all of our travelers in 2024. So as I said, the onigiri would be, kind of a street food, but also what it's really known for is being an element in a bento box. So I want to just mention bento boxes because these are pretty unique to Japan. They're portable, compartmentalized, boxes. You've seen them, no doubt. They're typically sold at train stations or convenience stores. And your typical bento will include rice and pickles and vegetables and protein. We offered vegan bento boxes. It was really fun to create our own boxes with tofu and seaweed and seasonal vegetables. I am one of these people who, I think I've said this before, like I really love smorgasbords. Like I really love like the idea of having like a number of different foods. Like in a bento box, you might have like 6 different elements or 8 different elements. And I think that's really fun. So you'll find onigiri in a bento box. The other thing that's unique to Japan that I want to mention are izakaya. So I mentioned them a little bit early on. They're Japan's version of a gastropub, and people gather for drinks and they share small plates. And it's true, many izakaya dishes have animal meat or seafood, but many will have grilled vegetables. They'll have edamame, they'll have agadashi tofu, ask for no fish flakes, they'll have pickled side dishes. But when we were there, there's a vegan izakaya in Tokyo. So please, if you're in Tokyo, go type in vegan izakaya in Tokyo. You will find it. There are not many, and we've met our animal activists there. So we've been there a couple times now, looking forward to going back again when we go back. So izakaya, it's very specific to Japan. Another thing that's specific to Japan is a yakitori. I mean, these are places where they basically grill meat. Honestly, I don't want to go to a yakitori even if I'd be able to find plant-based foods, because I do not want to sit around watching people just grill, and the smell would just horrify me. So I'm going to be really honest. I have not been to a yakitori because it's pretty much just a meat fest. And then I mentioned something specific also in terms of the types of cuisines, and that's temple cuisine, the Shojin Ryori, and that is traditional Buddhist monk cuisine. You know, many of the Shojin places that we've been to here in the United States, they are meant to model themselves on temple cuisine, but I think they just add a little bit more bump and flavor, because the temple cuisine we had when we were in Japan, it's okay. It's very simple. It's very simple. And I like simple food, but I will say that my association with Shojin cuisine before we went to Japan was just a little bit more positive. I loved some of the elements of the Shojin cuisine we had when we were in Japan, but if I had my druthers, if I had to choose, I mean, Shojin at home here in the United States, I'll take, like at Chaya or at Shizen, but Shojin in Japan was very lovely and very simple, but you have to experience it because it's done in a very ritualistic way. And then finally, drum roll to my favorite food of all time that we had when we were in Japan. Okay, excepting ramen, because ramen was definitely my favorite. But this is my second favorite. This is on par with ramen, was a dish we had never had before. It's considered a street food, and that is okonomiyaki. And thank you to Bridie and Seb and to our tour guides in Japan, because there are okonomiyaki restaurants. I think that's something very unique to Japan, is that, I think when we go to a restaurant here, we think about there's an Italian restaurant, there's a Japanese restaurant, there's a Chinese restaurant. And of course, it's not how they would be in the countries of origin, right? I've already said as much in the Italian series, but that goes for Japan as well. There will be restaurants that have kind of a variety of things, but you often will find that there is a ramen shop, there is an okonomiyaki restaurant, there is a soba restaurant. So they really specialize. There is a sushi restaurant. They specialize in the thing they specialize in. And that's something I really love about Japan. And so okonomiyaki, there will be okonomiyaki restaurants. And the term itself translates to whatever you want. And it refers to the customizable nature of okonomiyaki. So it's broken up, if you want to break up that word even more. Yaki means grilled. That should actually be clear when I said yakitori, because yaki in the yakitori does not mean grilled meat. It means grilled. Yaki means grilled. So let me say this slower, because I know it's very fast the way I'm saying it. So okonomiyaki is okono, so O-K-O-N-O, okono, and then M-I, mi, yaki, okonomiyaki. And so it basically translates to grilled as you like, or cooked to your preference. And it reflects the characteristic feature of being able to customize whatever you want. And it's really fun because you go to these okonomiyaki restaurants and there's a griddle, like your table is the grill. And you make what is essentially, for all intents and purposes, I'll just say a pancake. And what's kind of fun is that okonomiyaki traces its origins to Japan. Its roots primarily in the Kansai region, particularly in Osaka. So when we go back in April, we're going to Osaka, David and I, not with the group. We haven't been to Osaka before. And so that's where the historical origins are for okonomiyaki. And I can't wait to have Osaka okonomiyaki, because what we discovered in 2024 was that okonomiyaki is very specific to the region it's in. And if you remember me talking about this in part 1, just as in Italy, you have foods that are specific to the regions, you have the same thing in Japan. And so in Japan, you have Osaka okonomiyaki, Hiroshima okonomiyaki, Tokyo okonomiyaki, and each one is different. What we discovered in Tokyo, I'll talk about the one that's just kind of the one that's I think would make the most sense to you, is imagine a bunch of cabbage shredded, maybe some carrots shredded, imagine some green onions, right? Now imagine a very thin pancake batter, not a lot of it, but a little bit. You take all of these elements together, you put them in a bowl, and you create essentially enough of a moisture with these vegetables to hold it together for when you pour it onto the griddle. Now, once it's on the griddle, which is a pretty hot griddle, it starts to crisp up and starts to cook. And the pancake batter, basically it's a flour and water combination, starts to enable it to hold together. You flip it carefully, and then you grill the other side. And then you take it off the griddle. Actually, I think before you even take it off the griddle, you pour what would typically be a mayonnaise, but some places, the ones we go to obviously, have a vegan mayonnaise. And you then put it on your plate and you eat it. And it is absolutely, absolutely delicious. What we discovered was when we went to Hiroshima was there's another type of okonomiyaki, and that's yes with cabbage, yes with vegetables, but noodles are added. And so I don't know about you, but I mean, crispy noodles, there's nothing better than crispy noodles. And then the thing they also add is an egg on top. And so they used a just egg. So we had like the scrambled egg on top of our Hiroshima style okonomiyaki, which was absolutely delicious. And then apparently the Osaka one is completely different, and we're going to have that when we go and I'll report back. So that's one of the things I love about Japan. Was one of my takeaways was that it was similar to Italy and many other places around the world, where depending on where you go, the region that you're in, they specialize in a particular, crop, food, history, culture, obviously. And so you just have this kind of specialization that I think is really, special to put it uncreatively. And that's because I've been speaking for 90 minutes and I have no more words. Okay, I have just enough words left to say, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that answers the question. Now, as someone did ask me at that winery, what would you eat in Japan? I really would have wanted to take 90 minutes to explain, but I didn't have 90 minutes when I talked to them when I was at the winery. So I'm taking your 90 minutes up so that I can explain, there's plenty to eat in Japan if you're vegan. And most of it's already traditional. Most of it's already vegan by default. And all of it's delicious. So I hope that helps. Please go over to Plain Products. Well, go to joyfulvegan.com. Click on the link for Plain Products, get your personal care products, get 20% off, use Compassion or Joyful Vegan for your coupon code. If you have any questions, let me know. If I have forgotten anything, let me know. Perhaps someday you can join us in Japan. We are already taking pre-registrations for 2026, so we know we're already going back in 2026. For the animals, this is Colleen, Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening. Arigatou gozaimasu.